Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Anthony Collins, author of Words of Fire, independent journalist who challenged dictators, drug lords, and other enemies of a free press. Welcome to Rip Rap. This program is an unusually exciting pleasure for us because you're not only a scholar, but you've been there and done it. You've been in Bonn and London and even as a CNN correspondent, and we're even taken hostage. So it's quite a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. In fact, I was held at gunpoint, and that was an incident that got me thinking about doing this book eventually.
Well, one of the things that really was interesting is how you look at the magnitude of the problems facing journalists around the world. I mean, there isn't, seems like practically all the countries have some version of repression or some version of concern about what journalists might do in following the notion of free press. And in your book, Words of Fire, in fact, you mentioned that in just 1 year, last year, there were 24 who were killed and 81 who were in prison. Maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
That's right, and in fact, for me it's shocking to think that anybody would throw somebody in prison or assault them for telling the truth, but that is really what is happening. And one of the worst offenders is China, because of the 81 who were in prison at the beginning of this year, 22 were in prison in China alone. So it's become the biggest jailer of journalists in the world. In terms of violence, a lot of it takes place during drug trafficking incidents in Colombia, Mexico, parts of the Middle East, parts of the former Soviet Union, where they're not all democracies, and some of them have reverted to very repressive regimes.
But it was Asia and Africa and Russia. The woman was in Chechnya. That was reporting from the side of the people rebelling.
That's right.
Some really extraordinary stories.
Yes, I interviewed a Russian television correspondent named Yelena Masyuk, who's one of the bravest people I ever met in my life. She was held hostage for 101 days in a bear cave in the mountains of Chechnya, and finally was ransomed by her television network. Independent television in Russia. But not only was she attacked by the Chechen side, she was also threatened with prosecution by the Russian government. So she was being pressured by both sides for telling the truth about what was happening to the civilians in the fighting there.
One of the things that fascinated me as I read the book is how the journalists are in a way in a position to be gatekeepers of information. Although how well they're able to function, of course, depends on the people they work for and then the context that they're in. But it seemed like a really profound responsibility, and those that were trying to perform that, it is astonishing. As you point out in your book, that since 1812, more than 1,300 journalists have been killed while reporting the news. It just seemed like an extraordinary task.
Yes, and I was interested in finding out what is the extent of repression of journalists around the world. And I got interested in this subject because I had been myself attacked a number of times. I was jailed in Rome and arrested in Syria and Greece, and I was held at gunpoint in Lebanon while doing a story for CNN about a missile crisis. And the crew and I were captured and taken to a military headquarters in a part of Lebanon governed by Syria, controlled by Syria. And we were in fear for our lives. We thought we might be executed. Because in fact, a couple of weeks before that, a journalist that I had met at the hotel in Beirut was later killed, and his throat was slit.
Oh my.
And other journalists that I knew had been badly beaten by the Syrians. So we were terrified. But the story has a happy ending. I'm here, and the crew survived. And in fact, we were taken in to see a Syrian general. And he spoke in Arabic, which I don't speak, but a translator told us what he was saying. He said that we were Israeli spies, and we knew what the punishment was for Israeli spies. So at that point, we thought this is the end. Then he called over one of his privates, and he said something to the private, and the private left the room. And my thought was preparing the firing squad. But the private came back into the room a few minutes later with a big tray with packs of cigarettes and glasses of tea. And he proceeded to go around the table and put one pack of cigarettes and one glass of tea in front of each person, me, the cameraman, the sound man, and the driver, and the translator. So the cameraman asked me, what do we do? And I said, well, just do whatever the general does, you do. So the general lifted his glass of tea, we all lifted our glasses of tea. He drank, we drank. The general opened his pack of Marlboros, we all opened our packs of Marlboros. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it. So around the table, each person lit a cigarette except the cameraman sitting on my right. And I said, come on, light the cigarette. He said, I don't smoke. I said, today you smoke.
Indeed.
Yeah, and then the atmosphere changed and we were freed. But that incident left a big impression on me, and I thought about it for years afterward, and I wondered, how often does this type of thing happen to journalists? And that's what got me started doing the book.
Well, one of the things I reflected on also after reading your book is there was a definable moment when CNN entered the news reporting business. I mean, suddenly there was that global perspective, and I wondered if that was also a factor in intensifying at least our awareness of what was happening, but certainly our thinking as a global of news journalism, of having that accessibility. You know, during watching the Scud attacks, you know.
Definitely, I think that 24-hour cable news and the internet has brought people together, and things that happen in any part of the world are accessible immediately to you right here, right now. So someone has to bring that news to you. Someone has got to go out there where it's dangerous, find out the truth, and tell it to you honestly and fairly. And the ones who do it against the greatest odds and the greatest threats to themselves are the ones that I admire so much and that I've written about in my book.
Now, you've worked as bureau chief in Bonn and London for Newsweek, and then you worked for CNN, and I wondered, did you see that difference in perspective? I mean, in one, you're reporting specifically on a country from a capital, and then for CNN, there's just seems to be this broader perspective.
Also, when I joined CNN, it was during the first year. I joined in 1981, and CNN wasn't very big then. So I think in Atlanta, the headquarters, they had a very small map of the world, and you know, they thought that it'd be easy to get from one place to another. I was in Rome, and my friend Dick Blystone was in London. The two of us were covering Europe and the Middle East, basically.
My goodness.
So we were on the move. And there were a lot of big stories. The Pope was shot right after I started. Sadat was assassinated in Egypt, the leader in Egypt. There were terrorist attacks all over Europe. There were anti-American demonstrations in Germany. So we were on the move a lot. And CNN also wanted to make a name for itself by showing how much could be done with this all-news cable medium. So that meant we had to produce a lot.
So you're on the run and hit and go.
That's right. That's right.
It was a pretty spectacular beginning. I mean, at first it was CNN. And now, you know, 24-hour news is almost a given. People expect it, and there other channels or news sources are developing, some of them business, some of them stock market, some of them political. But it's amazing to think that, you know, before CNN there really wasn't that kind of access.
That's right. And there's wonderful new technology available too. I noticed that during the incident involving the American plane in China, CNN was able to use a device to get pictures out of the plane taking off when the crew was released. They had a combination video camera and telephone link up, completely without approval of the Chinese government, which wouldn't give its approval. And they were outside the airport getting these pictures, and it's live. And what I saw was the anchor back in Washington talking to the correspondent afterward and saying, "Is this dangerous for you?" And I'm sitting at home thinking, I know it's dangerous. And she said, "Yes, but you know, we have to do it." And while she's talking, a plainclothes policeman comes up, and then he puts his hand over the lens of the camera, and that showed me that, you know, they were taking great risks, but They did it because they felt this was an important story and the truth needed to come out.
One of the things, or a substantial portion of the book, discusses specific cases of independent journalists, challenging, as you have in the subtitle of the book, challenging dictators, drug lords, repressive governments, and other enemies of a free press. And then there's a photograph on the cover of your book of the Turkish editor. I'm not sure I can pronounce his name correctly. It looked like Oka Isik Yurtcu.
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 Yep.
And he's waving to fellow journalists from his prison cell after receiving an International Press Freedom Award in 1997.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. In fact, I focused on 1997 because a number of extraordinary things happened in that year, and that was one of them. The Turkish government permitted him to receive this award and actually have television coverage and still photographs like the one on the cover of the book, because this was at a time when the Turkish government was trying to improve relations with Europe. It wanted to have better trade relations with Europe, and it was coming under diplomatic pressure from the United States to ease up on some of its repression. So although he was still in prison, they permitted him to receive this award for courage and to show it being presented to him, and then he was later released from prison.
Well, I noticed some of that ambivalence of governments. On one hand, they're quite willing to let their journalists be awarded. At the same time, they're doing everything they can to muffle or repress what's going on. It's sort of a bizarre thing. But one thing we ought to mention is that there's these organizations that you've evoked in the book who are working to try to offset this violence, deadly violence for journalists. And maybe you can explain about that one committee.
Sure, yeah. There are a number of press freedom advocacy groups in the world, and the biggest one, and probably the most important one, is the Committee to Protect Journalists. It's based here in the United States in New York, and it's been around for 20 years. And they do a very good job of collecting statistics on attacks on journalists, acts of repression, suppression of journalistic free speech. They also organize protests and put pressure on governments. They persuaded President Clinton to raise the issue of press freedom in Argentina when he went there and saw the Argentine leader. So they are a main source for me for the book, and some of the journalists that I profile in the book have received awards from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and one of them I want to talk about. And I brought with me some pages from the newspaper of this publisher, who's one of my heroes. His name is Jesus Blanc Cornelis, and he's the publisher of a newspaper called Zeta in Tijuana. And what he has done is to report what he sees as the truth of the drug gangs that are operating so close to our border with Mexico there, because Tijuana is very close to San Diego. And he's repeatedly been warned, stay off of that story, lay off. And his attitude is total defiance. I'm going to do this story because, as he puts it, I'm a journalist, this is my job, to tell people about problems in society. After repeated warnings, he was the victim of an assassination attempt that almost succeeded. He was shot and wounded, and this is the front page of his newspaper right after that incident took place. This was in November of 1997, and this is the car that he was riding in. And over here is one of the assassins who himself was killed in the crossfire. And he later was identified as a hitman for the drug gang. And inside the newspaper, there's a picture of the publisher himself, Blanc Cornelis. And you see he's lying on a stretcher. He's just been taken out of the car. He's wounded, and he's rushed to the hospital where he's put into intensive care. I went down to Tijuana to interview him a few months after this incident, and he told me about the attack that he said a bullet entered his right side and split into two fragments. One fragment went up and almost hit his spinal cord, just stopped just short. The other one went into his intestines. He also had another bullet grazed across his right hand, and I could still see the scar when I interviewed him. He had difficulty walking, but he was determined to get up and greet me when I came to his home. What was really extraordinary is that his home was guarded by Mexican federal troops in combat gear with assault rifles and helmets. And when I was taken to his home to do the interview, I went from his office to his home, and I was accompanied by 2 armed guards wearing bulletproof vests and carrying assault rifles. And that was kind of nerve-wracking for me. But that gives you an indication of how much protection the Mexican government wants to give him, because the attempt on his life aroused so much anger and so much concern.
And he's continued publishing afterward.
That's the important point, that he's not intimidated. He's going on with it. And I asked him, I said, do you have any second thoughts? Are you going to, tone down? And he said, absolutely not. And in fact, he proudly pointed to the latest issue of the paper where he had yet another expose where he identified someone else from the drug gang.
It's incredible. Did you notice any pattern of differences in the kinds of repression among the different cultures in Asia or Africa?
I looked into that. It's a little bit difficult to generalize, because it's dangerous when you start saying that one culture is this way or not. But you can definitely see that, for example, in China, the main form of repression is imprisonment, at least as far as we know. What we hear about are journalists actually being arrested. There has been some violence. In fact, just last Saturday, an American journalist was beaten by Chinese police because he had taken a picture of a demonstrator being beaten by Chinese police. But the American embassy has protested, and the State Department has issued a statement trying to put pressure on China because they want to host the Olympics in the year 2008. And this is an example of how journalists can receive some protection if there are protests organized and take advantage of whatever leverage is possible. And that's possible in the case of China. But most of the violence that I came across was in countries such as Mexico or Colombia, where you have corruption by drug gangs, and the corruption means that the forces of law and order are unable to offer protection to citizens, including journalists.
But you've got stories from all those different cultures, and I just remember one picture that you have in that of an Israeli pointing a rifle at a Palestinian newsman, and it's I think what is another Israeli was saying, don't do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, he had the rifle pointed right at the guy's head.
That's right.
And you can see how the volatility of that situation, where it's just. And then there's also the one Palestinian newsman that keeps writing, from a Palestinian point of view, that I thought was really fascinating in terms of that issue.
And he's created his own website to get around the censorship, because that's another interesting point about the use of the internet by journalists.
Yeah, that was something I was really intrigued with, that the internet becomes an alternate news source that even though some governments like China try to regulate it, it proves just to be too complex, and it has sort of a disorganized organization, and so it's a way to post things, of news of interest to other people, and get it out anyway.
There's a kind of a cat and mouse game, or I call it cat and computer mouse game that's going on, and each side is trying to make use of this new medium to accomplish its own purpose. But I think the journalists may be winning in some respects. There's a wonderful example I can give you from Yugoslavia. There was a radio station in Belgrade called B92.
Right, yeah.
And Milosevic, when he was the leader in Yugoslavia, tried to control all the media. But the only radio station that he couldn't control was this one little independent station, B92. So they reported the news the way they saw it, and it wasn't all government propaganda. They reported incidents of Serbian oppression of ethnic minorities, the ethnic cleansing that went on. And Milosevic tried to repress them, and finally he found pretexts to take them off the air. But what they did was they took their audio signal and they put it on their website. That went out to the outside world, and then foreign shortwave radio broadcasters picked up that audio signal and sent it back into Yugoslavia. So people in Belgrade were able to hear their local Belgrade radio station by listening to the BBC or the German shortwave.
And learn a lot of information about what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting to me, as you write about China, that I think China is the only place where they've actually gone to the point of, in terms of censorship, of trying to intercept messages on the server and even set up an email system so that if keywords are said, like democracy, that it'll shut things down. And I was mindful of that. A friend of mine, a faculty member, is going to China in just a couple days, and we were talking about, trying to communicate back and forth. And she had been told that, if you never know when you're dealing on the internet in China, that they can just shut it down.
Yeah. But they're having trouble enforcing that.
Right.
They require that people register with the police when they're going to use the internet. But not everybody does, and there are internet cafes, cyber cafes, all over China, where it's up to the local manager whether he wants to register everything with the police or not. Also, there are emigre Chinese living here in the United States who are sending huge amounts of email back into China, what they call electronic spamming,
Right.
in order to defeat the efforts by China. It's sort of a new Great Wall of China that they've erected, an electronic one, to try to keep out information about the pro-democracy movement in China, or the Falun Gong meditation and exercise cult that the government's trying to suppress. Anything embarrassing to the government, they're trying to prevent it from being distributed by the internet, but these emigres are able to get around it just by overwhelming the defenses. And they send hundreds of thousands of emails in one huge transmission. And it's very difficult for the Chinese government to stop them.
Well, one of the things, again, as I was reading the book, you've got the title Words of Fire, and I'm thinking, these are just words. You're teaching communication studies now at the University of Michigan, but you think this is just words. They're just communicating words, and to have words, some people feel that the words themselves are so loaded that you have to go these extreme measures to literally kill the messenger. Has a kind of an angle to it that really is disturbing. That that these governments have become so obsessed with the perception of their image in the world, in the global village, that they would go to those measures.
Mm-hmm. It's very upsetting for me, and I quote a Mexican journalist, Jorge Castañeda, who says that every time a journalist is killed in Latin America, a bit of democracy dies with him. Because that's really what's at stake here, that these journalists are part of the whole system of democracy. And a lot of the battles that are taking place between the journalists on the one hand and the repressive forces on the other, these battles are taking place in societies that are newly opened, like Russia at the end of the Soviet period, Mexico, which is becoming much more of a pluralistic democracy. And it's during this transition period to more openness that some of the greatest danger comes out.
Well, and you point that the other institutions are not fully developed yet, and so they can't protect the people who are, trying to provide this information, and that the people themselves are just really anxious to get that information, know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see these struggles going on in places like Russia, even today, where the independent stations are almost constantly in danger of being shut down or messed with, or their signal jammed in one way or another. And the same thing's true, I think, in China. In your concluding chapter, you point out that some dynamics may bring about more favorable conditions, like political change.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that's happened in Russia with the although you're not exactly sure what the change is from Boris Yeltsin to Putin, but that may be a factor. Certainly the political conditions there are people are becoming aware you've got to accommodate some of this fresh air, kind of a thing. The internet itself, because there's so much information being distributed and accessible, like you were saying earlier. World trade is certainly a factor. People are looking at China saying, well, we want to bring more business your way, but if we're going to have more Tiananmen squares, then that bothers a lot of people.
In fact, China at one point tried to force everybody to use what it called ChinaNet, which was going to be
Right,
sort of a
yeah.
sanitized internet. All mention of democracy, Tibet, Taiwan, anything that the government didn't want to talk about would be removed. But it didn't work because Chinese business executives want to know what's going on in the world. They don't want a sanitized, censored version. They want to know what's really happening. So they want access to the New York Times website, the Associated Press, CNN, whatever's out there, Bloomberg, CNBC, all of it. And they need it for business reasons. And the Chinese government finally backed down and tried to come up with a more modest attempt at censorship.
And you know, like you mentioned in the book about Hong Kong would seem to be a desirable place to live, but it's right in one of those places of friction between China and the United States and the West and the East, and so there's only a huge awareness of how much stress and strain and
Hong Kong is a fascinating story. In fact, one of the people I spoke to, Bill Orm, who's the former head of the Committee to Protect Journalists, he said, keep your eye on Hong Kong because that'll give us an indication what's going to happen with this overall battle over freedom of the press in the world. Because Hong Kong is now part of China, which is a totalitarian regime with very strict censorship of the press. And yet Hong Kong has a free press. It's a very vibrant, freewheeling city. It's continued its tradition of an open and free press even after coming under the mainland's control. So it's a big question mark what's going to happen, but so far nothing really bad has happened in Hong Kong. There have been proposals from time to time to put some controls on the press, but they don't get very far. So we'll have to keep our eye on Hong Kong, and that could give us an indication, perhaps, what might happen in China itself.
Well, and we live in a time when violence is so very prevalent that those that are reporting on us, the societies and cultures around the world are drawn into that. And it's still fascinating that, you know, as I think about it, that it's words of fire that can, you know, put these people at risk and that they die. And while that's tragic, we have to admire their courage at trying to perform their job. Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you for having me here.